August 1949. The Pentagon. The atmosphere in the corridors of American power is not one of victory. It is one of venom. World War II is over. The Nazis are defeated. The Japanese Empire is dismantled. But in Washington, D.C., a new war has begun. It is a civil war, and it is being fought with a ferocity that rivals any battlefield in Europe. On one side stands the newly minted United States Air Force. They are young, arrogant, and they possess the ultimate trump card, the atomic bomb. Their argument is cold, efficient, and seductive. They claim that in the atomic age, surface fleets are obsolete. They argue that aircraft carriers are just floating coffins, expensive steel targets waiting to be vaporized by a single Soviet nuke. Their solution? The B-36 Peacemaker, a strategic bomber so large it casts a shadow over the entire defense budget. The Air Force doctrine is clear. The Army can handle the land. The Air Force will handle the sky. The Navy creates nothing but drift. On the other side stands the United States Navy, and they are desperate. They are being systematically dismantled. Their funding is being slashed. Their supercarriers are being canceled. Their admirals are being silenced. The Truman administration has essentially told them, "You are nothing more than a transport service. You are a glorified Coast Guard." Synthesizing Defense Policy, 1949. Impact of the Key West Agreement. The projection of nuclear power is the sole domain of the Strategic Air Command. The naval role is restricted to anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort. Offensive naval aviation is deemed redundant. Cornered animals fight the hardest. Facing extinction, the Navy admirals authorized a black project that defied the laws of aerodynamics and common sense. They needed a weapon that could break the Air Force monopoly. They needed a bomber that required no runway, a phantom that could launch nuclear devastation from any river, lagoon, or ocean swell on Earth. They went to the Glenn L. Martin Company and demanded the impossible. A roughly 160,000-pound flying boat designed to dash at Mach 0.9. The result was the Martin P6M SeaMaster. It was a technological anomaly, a machine so advanced it utilized a hull shaped like a stiletto knife, and so dangerous it killed the men who tried to tame it. This is not just the story of an airplane. It is the story of the revolt of the Admirals. It is a forensic analysis of a spy thriller that played out in the halls of Congress. And ultimately, it is the story of how the Navy spent $400 million to build the perfect aircraft, only to destroy it with their own hands, to make way for the true god of the Cold War.
To understand why the SeaMaster exists, we have to step away from the drawing board and step into the political slaughterhouse of 1949. The P6M was not born from a tactical need to bomb Moscow. It was born from a bureaucratic need to survive Washington. In 1947, the National Security Act changed the DNA of the American military. It took the Army Air Corps and turned it into the United States Air Force. This wasn't just a name change, it was a changing of the guard. The bomber generals, men like Curtis LeMay, believed they had won the war, and in their eyes, the atomic bomb made everything else redundant. LeMay's doctrine was absolute. He believed that the next war would be decided in days, solely by strategic bombing. If the Navy couldn't deliver a nuke to Moscow, the Navy didn't matter. The Navy saw the writing on the wall. They tried to adapt. They laid the keel for the USS United States, CVA-58. This was a monster, a flush-deck supercarrier designed specifically to carry heavy nuclear bombers. It was the Navy's physical claim to the nuclear mission. It was their survival raft. But on April 23, 1949, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, a man who openly despised the Navy, issued a brutal order. Without consulting the Admiral of the Navy, without a word of warning, he canceled the United States. The ship was scrapped 5 days after construction began. This wasn't a budget cut, it was an execution. It signaled that the civilian government had accepted the Air Force's logic. This ignited the firestorm known as the Revolt of the Admirals. The resistance went underground. It centered around a clandestine research unit called OP-23, led by the brilliant Captain Arleigh Burke. But the weapon they used wasn't a missile. It was a dossier. Enter Cedric Worth. Cedric Worth was a special assistant to the Navy. In the summer of 1949, he ghostwrote a devastating 9-page dossier simply known as the Anonymous Document. He circulated it to congressmen and press reporters in dark alleys and smoke-filled rooms. The contents were explosive. Worth alleged that the B-36 Peacemaker was a billion-dollar blunder. He claimed it was slow, vulnerable to jet interceptors, and structurally unsound. More damningly, he accused the Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, of corruption, claiming financial conflicts of interest. This dossier smeared the Air Force's crown jewel. It forced a congressional hearing that captivated the nation. And while the corruption charges against Symington were never substantiated by Congress, the technical arguments stuck. The Navy testified that the B-36 was a suicide machine. They argued that putting all of America's nuclear eggs in one basket, a basket that flew at 200 miles per hour, was madness. But this bureaucratic war had a body count. James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense and a former Navy man, found himself crushed between the Air Force's political machine and the president's budget cuts. He watched the Navy he loved being dismantled. The stress broke his mind. He resigned in March 1949, entering a deep depression haunted by the belief that he had failed his country. 2 months later, he fell to his death from the 16th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital. This is the emotional crucible of the SeaMaster. When the Admirals ordered this plane, they weren't just building a weapon. They were trying to justify their existence. They were trying to avenge Forrestal. They needed a plane that would make the B-36 look like a toy.
The Navy needed a miracle. They needed a strategic bomber that could bypass the Air Force's monopoly on runways. The logic was simple. The Air Force owns the land, the Navy owns the water. In April 1951, with the Korean War raging and defense budgets finally thawing, the Navy made their move. They turned to the Glenn L. Martin Company. Martin was the king of flying boats. They had built the China Clippers and the PBM Mariners. But the Navy's request was unlike anything Martin had ever seen. The specs were science fiction: a payload of 30,000 pounds, a combat radius of 1,500 miles, and a low-level dash speed of Mach 0.9. They wanted a boat that could nearly break the sound barrier. To understand why this is insane, you have to understand drag. A boat hull is designed to be buoyant, it pushes water. And airplane fuselage is designed to be slippery, it cuts air. Trying to make a shape that does both is an aerodynamic nightmare. The engineers, led by George Trimble, realized they couldn't just put jet engines on a traditional seaplane. They had to reinvent the hull. They ditched the wide, flat bottoms of World War II flying boats. Instead, they designed a hull with a radical length-to-beam ratio of 15:1. It looked less like a boat and more like a surfaced submarine, a hydrodynamic stiletto. It sliced through the water, but more importantly, it sliced through the air. But a sleek hull creates a new problem: stability. A narrow boat tips over. Traditional seaplanes solved this with massive floats hanging off the wings on struts. But struts create drag. At Mach 0.9, those struts would act like air brakes, or worse, they would rip off. Trimble's team came up with a solution that gave the SeaMaster its sinister, predatory look. They used an anhedral wing. They swept the wings back 40 degrees and drooped them downward. The wings sloped so aggressively that the fuel-filled tip floats sat directly in the water. At rest, the plane balanced on them. At speed, the lift bowed the wings upward, pulling the floats out of the water. No struts, no drag. Then there was the noise. To power this beast, they strapped 4 massive jet engines to the top of the fuselage. On the prototypes, these were Allison J-71s. They were underpowered for a ship this heavy. To get airborne, pilots had to use afterburners constantly. It was like setting off a bomb behind the cockpit. The engines were mounted so close to the fuselage that the sonic vibration and thermal exhaust slammed directly into the tail section. The acoustic energy was so violent it literally scorched the aluminum skin of the fuselage. It caused structural fatigue in the tail section before the plane even left the water. The pilots reported that the vibration rattled their teeth. But the true masterpiece was hidden in the belly. The Navy wanted the SeaMaster to carry nuclear weapons or mines. But you can't open bomb bay doors in the water, you'd sink. And you can't have leaky doors on a transonic jet. Martin stole a concept from a canceled attack bomber: the rotary bomb bay. The bomb bay door was actually the flat face of a rotating cylinder. In cruise, it was pneumatically sealed against the hull, perfectly watertight. When it was time to attack, the seal deflated and the entire drum rotated 180 degrees in seconds. It allowed the SeaMaster to remain a sealed vessel until the split second of the kill. It could drop a nuke while skimming the wavetops at 600 miles per hour, then seal itself back up before the spray hit the windshield.
The SeaMaster was beautiful. On paper, it was the savior of the Navy, but in reality, it was a killer. The jump from blueprints to the Chesapeake Bay would cost more than money. It would cost the lives of the men who dared to fly it.
The flight test program began in 1955. The man tasked with taming this beast was George Rodney, Glenn L. Martin's chief test pilot. But on December 7, 1955, Pearl Harbor Day, Rodney wasn't in the captain's seat. That duty fell to Morris "Mo" Bernhard. Along with a crew of 3, he took the first prototype up for a routine check flight over the Chesapeake. At 5,000 feet, cruising at high subsonic speed, the physics caught up with them. A control system fault drove the horizontal stabilizer to an extreme position. It wasn't a simple jam. The failure forced the massive aircraft into a violent bunt, a sudden high-speed outside loop where the nose tucks under. The negative G-forces spiked instantly,
snapping the crew's heads forward and overstressing the airframe beyond its structural limits. The engines were ripped from their mountings, the wings folded around the fuselage like a crushing hug. The SeaMaster didn't crash, it disintegrated in midair. Morris Bernhard and his 3 crew members never stood a chance. Their bodies were pulled from the freezing waters of the Potomac.
11 months later, the second prototype was ready. This time, the engineers had installed ejection seats. It was a grim admission that the machine was still untamed. November 9th, 1956. The pilot pushes the throttle. The speed climbs, and then history repeats itself. A modified hydraulic elevator jack fails. But this time, the plane doesn't bunt. It pitches up. The SeaMaster enters a tightening, uncontrollable loop. The G-forces build. The airframe begins to groan, then scream. The crew fights the stick, but the control surfaces are dead. Eject, eject. 4 rockets fire. The crew is blasted out of the dying machine just seconds before it breaks apart. They float down into the Delaware marshes, watching their $8 million prototype turn into a fireball below. 2 planes built, 2 planes destroyed. The Air Force generals in the Pentagon didn't have to say a word. The smoke rising from the crash sites said it all. The Navy was trying to do too much, too fast.
Despite the blood and the twisted metal, the Navy refused to quit. They refined the war plans. They created a vision of nuclear warfare that was radically different from the Air Force's massed bomber streams. The core concept was dispersion. The Air Force relied on massive, fixed bases. The SeaMaster would use the world as its base. SeaMaster squadrons were to be nomadic. They would deploy to seadromes, remote lagoons, sheltered bays, or river estuaries in places like the Philippines, Norway, or the Mediterranean. They would land, camouflage themselves against the coastline, and wait. But the most terrifying element of the plan, the one that kept Soviet planners awake at night, was the refueling concept. The Navy began testing a radical idea: refueling these jet bombers from submarines in the open ocean. They converted a World War II Gatto-class submarine, the USS Guavina. They welded massive saddle tanks to its outer hull to test the feasibility of storing aviation fuel underwater. Though the Guavina primarily conducted tests with the older P6M Marlin, the intent was clear: to mate this submersible tanker with the SeaMaster. The operation was fraught with danger. The jet would taxi to the submarine's stern. Crewmen on the wet, rolling deck of the sub would drag heavy fueling hoses across the gap. It proved that the concept was possible, that you could refuel a nuclear bomber in the middle of the ocean, miles from any land. While the nuclear mission grabbed the headlines, the Navy had a second, arguably more practical use for the SeaMaster: mine laying. The SeaMaster's rotary bomb bay was optimized for this. It could carry 30,000 pounds of Mk-25 or Mk-50 mines. A single squadron of P6Ms could fly a high-speed, low-level dash, often below 500 feet, into Soviet waters. The SeaMaster's rugged hull, built to smash waves, made it one of the few aircraft tough enough to handle the turbulence of low-level flight at that speed. They could seed choke points like the Dardanelles and bottle up the Soviet submarine fleet before the war even started.
By early 1959, the darkness seemed to be lifting. The Martin engineers had redesigned the tail. They had solved the acoustic scorching. The new production model, the P6M was rolling off the line with massive Pratt & Whitney J75 engines. It was powerful, stable, and lethal. The Navy had ordered 24 aircraft. And then the phone rang. The twist in the SeaMaster story is that it wasn't killed by the Air Force. It wasn't killed by the crashes. It was killed by the Navy itself. Specifically, it was killed by a tube. While Martin was struggling with control systems, another group of Navy engineers, Admiral Red Rayburn's team, was achieving the impossible with solid-fuel rocketry. They had created the Polaris missile. Admiral Arleigh Burke, the hero of the Revolt, the man who had fought so hard for the SeaMaster, looked at the numbers, and the numbers were brutal. The P6M SeaMaster cost millions per aircraft. It required a pilot, a crew, and a massive support fleet of tenders and submarines. It was vulnerable to enemy missiles. The Polaris submarine carried 16 warheads. It was invisible. It was invulnerable. It required zero support in the combat zone. Burke was a warrior, but he was also a pragmatist. He prioritized Polaris. The Navy budget couldn't support both. Funding shifted, and the P6M never stood a chance. The cancellation order in August 1959 was unusually cruel. It didn't just say, stop. It said, erase. The Navy feared that if the P6M airframes remained, Congress might try to revive the program and force the Navy to use them, diverting precious funds away from the Polaris program. They needed the SeaMaster to disappear physically. At the Martin factory in Baltimore, the workers who had spent a decade building these silver birds were ordered to destroy them. The remaining airframes and tooling were broken up for scrap. P6M2s that had just rolled off the line with 0 flight hours were reduced to metal shards. The jigs, the templates, the specialized machinery, nearly all of it was lost. Martin tried to save the design. They proposed a civilian luxury version called the Martin 307, Ocean Mistress, a massive 8-jet liner for the jet set. But the world had moved on. The Boeing 707 owned the skies. The cancellation broke the Glenn L. Martin Company's aviation spirit. They pivoted away from aircraft, focusing on missiles and electronics. They would eventually merge to become Martin Marietta in 1961, and decades later, Lockheed Martin. But they never built another aeroplane. The Martin P6M SeaMaster is often remembered as a failure, a billion-dollar boondoggle that killed 4 men and produced nothing. But that is the wrong way to look at it. Technically, it was a triumph. It proved a boat could fly at transonic speeds. It proved a rotary bomb bay could work. It pushed the boundaries of aerodynamics further than any seaplane in history. Its failure was one of timing. It was designed for the brief, terrifying window between the age of the bomber and the age of the missile. Had it flown in 1950, it would have been the strategic weapon of the decade. By 1959, it was an anachronism. But the SeaMaster achieved its primary, unstated goal. It kept the U.S. Navy in the game during its most vulnerable hour. It served as a technological bluff, holding off the Air Force's monopoly until the submarines were ready. The Air Force feared the SeaMaster, not just because it was a formidable machine, but because it represented the indomitable will of the U.S. Navy. It was proof that the admirals would defy physics, budgets, and politics to ensure that when the next war came, the strike would come from the sea.